what we're doing, or what I like to do, is you're building up a muscle. And if we think of creativity as a muscle that you can train and use, and then you get to go out into the wild and use all your training.
That was Steve DeFrank. He's a successful New York artist, and his artworks are in major collections and museums. His work has been displayed in many exhibitions. I invited him today because of his decades of experience teaching at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Steve was one of the artists who I interviewed for my book called Learning to See, and I learned a lot from him and our interview. So I think you really will too. If you like this episode, I hope you'll rate the show and like it and share it with other people like you who might like this episode. Now, here's our interview. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining the Science of Creativity today.
Thank you, Keith, for inviting me.
Well, we're going to have a great conversation about art and creativity and design. And I wanted to start by asking you, given that I'm a creativity researcher, how do you teach students how to be creative?
Oh, Keith, that question right there is really the heart, because what you just said in your question is creative, right? And what you didn't say was how well can they draw, how well can the students paint or sculpt, but it's creativity. And my job is to really help the students figure out how to use their creativity. And that could be through prompts, through lectures, but mainly it's like allowing them to feel good and to take risks about their process. And the enemy is the product of creativity.
Ah,
It's odd because in a university, in school, it's always about the end. And I have to take these students and I have to say, not really, because you're going to get to the end eventually, but it's getting there, and it's being able to be open and to see other avenues that might take you down a river or a rabbit hole, right? But it's our job. And it's also to allow those rabbit holes, those dead ends, to not feel devastating. And it's to be able to sort of go, oh, what did I just learn there? But we're so concentrated, not just in school, but everywhere, about how does it look in the end. I can't deny that that's important, but when you're teaching, I try to lessen that focus on the end result.
that's fascinating. And I know you've taught at the School of Visual Arts since 1993. So you're very wise and very articulate about doing this. So that's I guess, shouldn't say death of creativity, but that blocks creativity, this focus on the endpoint. So then what do you do instead if you're not focused on where your artwork is going? What do you do instead?
Well, what do you do instead is, because what we're doing, or what I like to do, is you're building up a muscle. And if we think of creativity as a muscle that you can train and use, and then you get to go out into the wild and use all your training, right? And it's like, so what I try to do is I have open-ended projects or prompts that don't allow you to think, oh, I can do X, Y, and equals Z. But it's like, if I add this or I add something else to this, what do I get? And it's like teaching curiosity, teaching experimental, being how to be experimental, and then like putting it into the work. And then at the end of a project, we talk about it. And yes, I do talk about the skill levels and certain techniques and, elements of design, but I also talk about what was it like to make that? Like I'll ask a student, okay, so we talked about all the details, we talked about the skill and, the elements of design, but then I say, hey, Keith, how was it for you to make that piece? What was going on for you, and it's like I felt nervous. I was excited. I didn't know where it was going. And then all of a sudden I had this idea. When you have the idea, when you have the spark, it's just perspiration after that point, right? You have to get that moment of that epiphany, that spark. And then all the rest is instinct. And I'm there to help train that. I don't know if that made sense.
No, it's absolutely. That's fascinating. So you're in this process, and we're not just talking about students, we're talking about anybody who's engaged in art.
Yes.
And you're not
Yes.
sure where it's going, and you're not sure what the endpoint is. And I know you work this way in your own practice, but that sounds very anxiety provoking for someone to not know where they're going. So people might want to avoid that, right?
With every fiber in their body. That's what procrastination is all about. There is a fear and there is an anxiety. And that is sometimes a blocking method, but it also can be the thing that propels you forward. I'm not going to get this quite right, but I remember reading a book about Matisse and anxiety. And Matisse, and I'm really paraphrasing here, Keith, but Matisse had this idea of like, he said, I could have been a very content, still life painter. But there was an anxiety within me that propelled me to go forward that was like, this is not quite right, or I want to see it differently. And it's that voice in our head that says, what else? And there it comes with that anxiety. But what helps me with the anxiety is I start something, I make a mess, a true mess. And then it's my job to clean it up or to paint myself out of the mess. And then with students or anybody in the creative process, it's like learning to take that breath and go and see where it can end up. And the minute you make a mark, that anxiety will dissipate, will lessen, because then you have something concrete in front of you. And then you go, oh no, that's not right. Let me do this. And next thing you know, you spent 4 hours and time has disappeared. Or you spent 4 hours and it's an utter disaster. And then you have to reckon with that and think, okay, where do I go? But anxiety is a part of it. And we all have it. I see students, avoid it. And sometimes you want to avoid it and it's harder when you avoid it. And, when you just get started, like my saying is, work begets work. And if I do something that's a failure, I then have something to look at to say why. And then I can work on it again. So anxiety, unfortunately, is part of this process.
And the way to get over it is to just start working. You said make a mark. And you would say, it sounds like you would say that students who aren't used to working in this way, are they afraid of making the first mark?
Yes, the students are terrified at times about making a mark. And because they feel like there's so much weight on that. And then we have to talk about, like, isn't it funny or odd that it's a drawing or a painting or a sculpture and it develops all this fear, right? And you think about lawyers and doctors and all of that, and it's like, well, they must have the same thing too. But really, what I do with these students is I'm like, it doesn't matter. We're in a classroom situation or you're in your studio alone. No one's going to see you. No one's going to think how, like they're feeling vulnerable and judged, as we all do. I think every artist feels these things, these emotions, and we want approval. And in a classroom situation, all of that comes together and it makes you freeze. So what do? I make a fool out of myself. I make it funny and ridiculous. And then that makes everybody drop their shoulders. And then it's like, oh, if I make a mark, it doesn't really matter. Right? Like when I used to do this, Mark, in my class, I used to have the students, I would time like 60 seconds on my phone and they would write art as many times on their pads as they could. Right. And so they're just writing art, 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 art. And then after the 60 seconds goes by, sorry, 60 seconds, I say, okay, now take an eraser and erase art for 60 seconds. And I'm like, so then they start erasing everything that they did. And then I say, now look at what you have, right? And it's a pad, a newsprint pad that has all these eraser marks, and art was erased all over the place. And I said, okay, so now we're not making art anymore. We're going to just start making lines. And it's ridiculous, right? But it gets rid of that self consciousness. Everybody's laughing in the classroom. They're having a common experience that is ridiculous. And I don't know how this will come across. The process of making art is ridiculous. Don't get me wrong, Keith. I love it. I love everything about it. But the fact that I spend 8 hours a day not talking to anybody, struggling over a curve, a paintbrush, a line, and I will be agonized by this. There's something amazing and ridiculous about it. And yet we've been doing it for well, millennia. So
And it sounds like the key really is this way of working. It's a way of being. It's a way of seeing, I suppose. I mean, that's why I called my new book Learning to See.
and I love the way you wrote it, the cover, and the way see is because you just got the process, right? You just got it. It's like, oh, if you see it like this or see it like that or see it this way. But isn't that our job? We're investigators, we're detectives, And it's like, how do you see the word see? But if you make it backwards, if you don't, it's like that fun, that play there. So you got it with like, yes, it's all about seeing and how we interpret that seeing.
So you start in a place where you don't have an ability to see. That sounds sort of critical of these 18-year-olds to say they don't know how to see. So they might resist that. So what do you mean? What's the difference between being able to see and not being able to see?
So, oh my God, Keith, I love this question because it's so bizarro because we have different sets of eyes, right? When I'm on the subway, I'm not using my artistic eye. I can't. It's too much information. I have to go through life, editing constantly. But when I'm on the subway headed to SVA, the School of Visual Arts, in the classroom, I have to have the students learn how to turn on their artistic eye and turn off their pedestrian eye. And the notion of what we see versus what our brain interprets what we see, two very different aspects. So, what I do is I have all the students bring in fruit. I get apples and oranges and whatever. And I say to them, okay, without looking at your object, make a contour line using one line and draw your fruit. Now, 90% of the time, I get a cartoon version of that fruit. And then what I do is I pair up the students together, and one student has to be blindfolded. The other student has to hold the object in their hand and describe the object to the student. And the student has to draw what they hear and not what they see. Now, what I do, and it's ridiculous, right? How you're making a student draw blindfolded, right? And so it's like the students are like, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to be able to draw anything. That's kind of the point. But then the student doing the describing can't say, I have an apple in my hand. They have to describe it's a hard, round object. And then you have to start at the top of your pad and go to the left, go around, and they're describing everything. So the student has to follow those instructions. And then after 3 minutes, they take off their masks and they look, and there are peals of laughter in the classroom. They're just, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And then we switch it and they have to do it again. And but now vice versa. Then what I do is I'm like, okay, everybody, what do you think we just did? And we get jokes about, drawing blind and all of that. And I said, but what did you have to do when you held the object? And they said, well, I had to really describe it. I had to look at it. I had to let the other person know what it was that I was holding, what was the texture, right? Right there. They're describing it. And I said, okay, now that's the dialogue you want in your head. You want to turn off your brain and just use your eyes to describe what you see because your brain is going to interrupt you and tell you what they think the apple should look like. Your eye doesn't do that. Your eye is just a reporter at the scene, describing to the viewer what is going on. And so the student has to turn off the outside world. They have to turn their focus 100% onto an object. I'm training them how to use their artistic eye right then and there. They know how to turn it on, and they don't know how to turn it on yet, but they will. And then I say to them, go draw on the subway. Look at the person across from you and draw them. They have to use the same eye. Then I have to tell them, you can't use that eye everywhere or you'll go crazy. Right? So we start learning how to see, how to talk internally to ourselves. And Keith, it's that dialogue between the artist, the hand, and the eye that we need to concentrate on. That is the primal, that is the instinct, right? The brain will interrupt that. It's a lot of noise, a lot of static in that brain. And that's why I love working in the studio because I turn off the brain. And that is the elixir for all of it, for me, part of it. Part of it. That's what the goal is.
You turn off your brain to enable your eye to see better. So does that mean that your brain is a barrier? Is it interfering with your ability to see?
At first, yes. Definitely at first, because especially when you're doing a contour drawing, and I use at first blind contour drawing, and that is when you are looking at an object or a person and you do not look at your pad, you only look at the object and you're drawing without seeing the pad. Now, when you turn your attention to the pad, you just see scribbles. And every student will say, that doesn't look like an apple, and they'll be very critical, like these look ridiculous. And I say, no, it doesn't look ridiculous. That is an observed line. And now we have to use the vocabulary. What is observed line versus an unobserved line? And we talk about the time it takes to draw a line and how quick we can do it, right? But so then when we go to do the actual contour, a quote from students would be, that doesn't look like the object I'm working on. And I'm like, but that's what it looks like. Yeah, but an apple is round. I said, no, it's not. Look at your apple. Look at how it tapers down at the bottom of the points. Look at the dent in that apple. That's not round. Your brain, which has been fed objects from illustrations since a childhood, cartoons, that what it should look like. So we have to really break the notion of what we think an object looks like to what it actually looks like. The brain wants it to look acceptable. Students, when drawing portraits, will put the portrait the eyes of the portrait, like in the forehead. And I say, no, if you look at a face, it's smack dab in the middle. And it's like they think, oh my God, I'm spending all this tuition money and my teacher thinks eyes are in the middle of a head. Oh my God. So then I get the model and we measure. Yes, exactly. Exactly. And then they see it and they're incredulous. But that's not right. That's what I fight all the time. That's not right. That's your brain. That's the brain fighting you. You have to trust your eye more than what your brain is telling you. And once you're able to break some of that, because that is just unobserved thinking. But once you start understanding that, your brain goes, oh, look at that. Then it wants to know what else happens, right? Then it's like, oh, wait, you mean the nose lines up to my earlobe? Wait, what? And then all of a sudden they start seeing this and your brain gets sticky and goes, oh, that's really cool. And then they can start to join forces. They've been disconnected for the majority of their 18 years. And now we're going like this, even though they've been in high school and drawing, and some have better teachers than others, but we have like a baseline. And then we can start doing that. And for me, watching these little moments of spurts of growth, especially foundation year, Keith, is music to my eardrums. I love that. So, yeah, it's an interesting process.
You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms. Well, it sounds like you're describing, and some listeners might not know, but the foundation year is the first year. So these are students who, as you've been saying, the disconnect between the mind and the brain. And so
Yes.
You feel like you can see it when a student starts to get it. Can you see that?
Yes, because there's a little bit more risk taking when the drawing isn't perfect, when a natural object looks like a natural object. And that to me is when I start knowing. And when there are lines, so in class, Keith, I will set up the assignment like contour drawing and we practice it in class. And then they go home. And I have to see how do they interpret what we just did in class independently. So when they come back, and this is when they want to hang their artworks up and they spend 10 hours for homework on a drawing and they're excited about the critique. And I start saying, that's not an observed line. And all of a sudden the students are like, how could you tell? I'm like, look at how fast that line is. I said, you all spent like 3 hours drawing an apple without looking at it, and look at your lines. So then all of a sudden in class, without me prompting, they'll say, oh, that's an observed line. And then in class, they're drawing and they're not just whoosh, whoosh as fast as they can. They're slowing down, not by me telling them, because they want to spend time with it. And that's when I get to see it, and at the end of the semester, like after we've had 9 months together and at the final critiques, when I'm listening to the students talking and they're using the vocabulary that we've used all year long and they can physically point to it, I know I've done my job. I know they can go to their sophomore year with more knowledge than they came in with. And I love that. And I also love it for other reasons because these kids come in from all parts of the world, nervous and scared, and they're in New York City. And the emotional changes that they go through in that first year, Keith, is some of the most amazing things I've ever seen. in my life. And sophomore and juniors, they get a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more arty farty, and they're a new facade comes on. But freshmen, they're a little bit more exposed. I love that. I love that so much. So there's a lot of change in that first year.
I remember when I interviewed you, it was all the way back in 2022, and you
Yes.
described students saying, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know how hard it was to draw. I didn't know art school was going to be this hard."
I that is the biggest surprise to the students, and that right there, Keith, is when I am at the end of the year. It's I say to them, "What was the biggest surprise to you about being in art school?" Without an exception, it's I never knew how hard it was going to be, and I think a lot of the students think it's going to be easy. And most of these kids are coming, they're the top of their class from all these high schools. And then they're coming in, and we have these weird teachers teaching them all sorts of strange ideas and notions and all of that. But I get like, like I make my students stand up. Our classes are 6 hours long. And they're like, my arm hurts. Like, oh my God, what a privileged life you've led. It's like, and then can I please sit down? And it's really interesting, like part of the physicality of it. But more than that, that's just more jokey. It's their brains hurt from thinking. It's like, wait, you're asking me to do what? Like when we start thinking about negative and positive space, all of a sudden I'm telling them that the space around an object is just as important as the object itself. Those concepts are new, right? Like, wait, there's a positive and negative in what? And we have to see it. And then the students will get it, right? They're like, I get it. And I'm like, I set up a still life and it's really complicated. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, you're not drawing. I come up, I'm walking around the classroom and I walk up to a student. I'm like, you're confusing the negative with the positive. And they're like, what? And I'm like, that's not the negative space, that's the positive space. And you could see them, they're frustrated, they get angry, and they're like, I don't understand. I'm like, I know, because you've never done this before. Right? And then we have to, I have to like project things. Like I'll take the projector in the classroom and I'll just have a white light and then I'll put objects in front of it. And I'm like, just draw the light and not the shadow. And then I see the bing go off. Oh. And then I usually ask, what just happened? What happened when you said, oh, you don't want us to draw the object, you want us to draw the air. I'm like, yeah, that's basically it. Right. And then they see it. Right. But it's so much fun, and then I go, okay, now let's have fun with this. And I said, because artists use this all the time. And then we will say, now make a drawing confusing negative and positive one drawing. And again, the student's brain gets fried, but then they have to start using design and all of that. So it's fascinating to see. I start to look at it, and what I love about it too is like I get to go back to my studio and I'm like, oh yeah, that negative and positive, I'm going to play with that, you know? And so it leaves it fresh for even myself, like you said, I've been teaching for like 30 years. And Mark, I'm sorry, Keith. I'm used to talking to my therapist. His
Right.
name
No,
is
I'm
Mark.
not qualified. That's right.
There's a fine line between art and therapy.
That's right.
But I use them to help myself, and it never gets boring. It just doesn't get boring after all these years because they're learning something. It reinforces it for me. And so it's like we're feeding each other. That the thing the students don't realize is that they're helping me too, and it's a lot of fun for me to do that. They just think it's a one-way street, but it's not at all.
Well, it's wonderful. Yeah, it is a wonderful career in that case where you're connecting your own creative practice with what you're doing in the studio class.
Exactly.
Your story that you gave me the example, it sounds like you can't just tell people what they need to know. So you could stand up there and say, well, here's positive and negative space, and you can give a lecture and you can put up some PowerPoint slides. But then the students still will do something where you can tell they don't see it yet.
Yes. And that's the point, because they can take it in and say they understand it. But then when you actually go into practice, they don't. And I can only vouch for myself, but as a visual learner, I could be in a lecture class and all you hear is the peanuts, womp, 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 right? And, I'm listening, but I'm not taking it in. But the minute I have to stand at an easel, oh, that's what you meant, right? They get it more physically as they're doing it. And they will start to see it. And then when they start screwing up, or I shouldn't put it that way, but when they sort of don't have the understanding, we can sit there and look at it and I can point it out. They can see it. And it's again, when they see it, and let me define that is like when I'm looking at the still life and I'm pointing out a negative space, they go, oh, I didn't see that. And I'm like, oh, right? Because their brain is shutting it down because it's too much information. And we have to start in little bits. And how do you start, right? How do you start? And they think about like, sometimes they do all these sketches and I'm like, no, I don't want you to do a sketch of it. I just want you to be like, just look at the negative space and draw it. Again, they're very concerned about getting it right. And by right is, does it look like a ladder? Does it look like a feather duster? And I'm like, I don't care if it doesn't look like that. What I'm concerned about is if you can get the negative space in between that. And we're recording that. And eventually they can clean it up as they keep going because every prompt, every project builds on the next one. So we start with a line and then we start moving and moving up to more complicated. It's just like adding ingredients into a salad and trying to make the most delicious salad you can eat. But we got to start out with just iceberg lettuce, and then we build on top of that.
Well, you're right. What you said at the very beginning is that it's not about the final object because everything you've been saying you teach, you're not talking about how to generate something that looks good or how to draw an accurate representation of this object. You haven't said anything about that. You have only talked about the process and about seeing.
Yes, exactly. And that is the most confounding part because these kids have been taught, like how to render, how to make something look like that object. And that, yes, in some parts of the world, that will be very important. But that just is one way of working. That is one result. And, there are so many other options. So when our course and foundation comes to the figure, right? And we start drawing the figure, which that gets very complicated. There's so many other aspects in there, but I ask the students to think about what is the notion of finish? What does it mean to be finished? And for most of the student, that means every hair is in place, every toenail is done, every wrinkle, tattoo. And then I start challenging that idea, right? Because we're not machines. We're not cameras. We're human. We have slants that might be off in proportion, but that's what makes us who we are. So we can talk about accuracy and we can accept that. And I can make my drawing about that, but I also might want to know who's behind the pencil. Where is there slant? Where is there a little off? And then you have the moment when you can say, I can fix this, or I can leave it. Or maybe that leg that's supporting the weight is going to be really heavy. And maybe the leg that's very up on the stool is not holding weight. Maybe I can depict that with a lighter touch. Oh, so now I can tell weight by the weight of the line, right? So now I'm not recording, I'm emphasizing, right? So there's more to that accuracy than just a perfect replication. And I think that is the hardest thing, especially when it comes to the human figure, because they want to make it look right. And I'm trying to have them think about what does right mean. And sometimes they will get, it will look like the figure. And sometimes I don't want that, Keith. I don't want it to look exactly like the figure because the students will go around and go, oh, Joey Bag of Donuts did a beautiful job. Oh my God, Nina, nobody just made that perfect. That's my enemy in the classroom because then it gets generic, it gets boring, and yet there's many accolades from the outside world that, oh my God, you can make a drawing look just like Keith. And that is wonderful. But there's more to you than just a perfect rendition, right? And so when we talk about lines, like I'm a guy who has a lot of energy, a lot of anxiety, and I ask them to draw me, but with nervous lines, with an anxious line, because maybe that could tell me something about the portrait other than an exact replication, right? Can you get the feeling of Steve? Can you get the feeling of Keith, right? Without having it to be photographic. And, the end result might be when they're seniors in their fields, they will have the ability to render, but hopefully with a little bit more curiosity and a little bit more interpretation. Because I swear to you, Keith, anybody can learn how to draw. Anybody can learn how to draw academically. It's just that you have to want to do it and you have to work out, you have to practice it, but it's one way to do it. It's not the only way. And there's so much more behind it. What I want to be able to do is like give the students a choice and they can choose how they want the end result to be. But in the beginning, they think there's only one way. And I'm saying, well, there's many ways. Look at all the choices of pencils you have to draw with. There's not one pencil to draw with, right? There's many in that kit of pencils. You have a choice. And I want to make sure the students all have a choice. And not it's because they have to, but they want to. And then that's the point when their education and their, if further on, but I'm gearing them up. I'm setting them up for that.
I'm fascinated by this idea that you need to learn when it's finished or that you might not know when it's finished. So if you're sketching a figure, I don't know, I'm hearing that maybe you do one foot and you don't quite finish the other foot and you just leave off the second foot. And if you can see in the special way, would you look at this drawing and say, I think it's finished even though one of the feet isn't there?
Yes. Or how about this, Keith? Maybe there's 4 feet because the model, when they were taking a break, the foot changed. And so then the student turns to me and they whisper, so they don't want the model to hear, but it's like, the model moved. And I say, I know, can you believe it? That body moved. I said, and I'm like, so make it part of the drawing, right? And then I show them that, hey, listen, Degas did that. Degas, these paintings that go on auction for millions of dollars, he has a woman ironing, and Degas couldn't figure out where the arm was. And yet he had the courage to leave it. Is that finished? If I go to MoMA, it's in MoMA, and someone thought it was done, but yet there's four arms, right? So again, we have to challenge what we think is finished, right? Because sometimes leaving off a foot can talk about the weight or the foot not being there. Now, as a first year professor, there are certain habits that students fall into, such as never drawing the head of a model and never drawing the hands and feet. So I get these very, lopped bodies. That's fear. They're afraid to draw the head. They're afraid to draw the hands and feet because those are really hard. I'm like, yeah, but everything about the body can be complicated. And again, it's like I need to sort of show them and let them know that a hand is no more complicated than a torso. And, it's just somehow they've learned, someone told them hands and feet are the most difficult things you can ever draw. Well, they're approaching it with all that history in their head. And I have to say to them, you've never seen a hand or a foot before. You think you do, but maybe you're an alien from an alien planet and you have to now describe to your homeland, your planet, your grandma, what a human foot looks like because you've never seen one. Just draw it like you would an orange. And they have to disconnect themselves from what they think how hard it is. And then we go from there. And then when I start showing them like a Leonardo da Vinci foot, and they're like, there's nothing there. I'm like, exactly right. And so and then I'm like, guys, you got to see how other artists dealt with these same issues because this is nothing new. And being in New York, we're really lucky. So then I can send them out to museums and galleries and I can say, you're going to go to the Frick collection and you're going to look at like Bronzino and you're going to look at those hands. You're going to look at those not modernist, those mannerist paintings. And I'm like, they're not anatomically correct. That body would look like a giant if it got up off that chair. And I said, so you're just being dazzled by the surface, but you're not being analytical about what you see, right? And then they're like, oh, maybe it's okay. Like, Keith, am I talking too much?
No,
I
no,
feel
it's
like
wonderful.
okay,
Wonderful.
okay. I'm sorry. But like one time in class with drawing the figure, I'm walking around the classroom and I have this female model and I am looking at all the students' drawings and I'm like, why are they drawing the hands and arms so long? Like the disproportion was wacky. And I said to them, I said, okay, I don't know what's going on. I said, everybody, put your pencils down. We got to talk about measuring, right? Talking about like knowing what you see versus what you know. I know that a hand, when standing, comes right above on the side of your knee if you're standing straight. But everybody was drawing this one model with her leg, with her hands almost touching her calves. And I'm like, you guys, this is crazy. You're not measuring. My model turns to me and said, Steve, I have extremely long arms. And I'm like, excuse me? And I look at her, and there they are, Keith, her arms going like right down to her calves. There's an example of me not looking at the model. And so I'm guilty of it too. I turn off those eyes. And I was like, okay, guys, you were doing it really well. It's just that, so it's really fascinating because they were drawing what they see. And I wasn't, I was in autopilot mode, you know, and I know certain aspects about the anatomy that, some generalizations that I can throw out, but I wasn't looking. So always it goes back to that eyeball of ours.
I think you can do this so well because you're a successful practicing artist yourself. And I've been to your website and I've looked at your work, and it's very impressive. And listeners, I'm going to put links in the episode notes. So I have a question for you. Your work is very abstract. And if your work is
Yes.
abstract or non representational or whatever term you like, it seems to me it would be a lot harder to know when you're finished because you're not there's no chance of you copying something there. So how do you know when you're finished with a non-representational piece of art?
Oh my goodness. The question as old as time when talking to artists, abstract, figurative. Um, just to give a quote from William de Kooning, and he said, I've never finished one painting in my life. I've abandoned all of them. Right. And so there's an aspect of that. And, I was trained very academically with the figure. And I needed to know what it was like to take away the thing that I loved most. And I said, okay, I'm no longer going to paint the figure, but I'm going to be a figurative painter. Right. And how do you do figurative painting without a figure? I love all the tricks of academic painting, and I do think they're tricks. But so I started to incorporate some technical aspects of my work. But to really get down to your question, how do you know when to finish or when to stop?
When to stop, yes.
When to stop is, like I get a sense, I get a feeling. And, I sometimes with my own work, I could be like a little kid who found a bird and it's like wants to hug them too much. And then next thing you know, you crush the bird and it's dead. I will overwork my paintings because I think I need to finish them. And I've learned to stop and live with them in what I say is an unfinished state. And sometimes that unfinished state, as much as I want to scratch the itch to finish, I have to let it be because it has a little bit of more energy. It has a little bit more, it has an interesting quality. And then if I push it too far, I suffocated the painting. I overworked the painting. And I'm trying not to do that. So it's like, okay, I think this is over. I think this is over. Just yesterday, I was working in the studio and I just wanted to put little finishing touches and I got carried away. And I'm like, shoot, I just overworked it, just by just doing a little finishing work. And I was like, oh, I should have left it alone. Right. And it's always so to answer the question, there's a feeling and you have to live with it for a little bit. And then if it needs more, you'll finish it. So very hard, very difficult.
Well, fascinating. And it's actually about time for us to end our interview. So we're being meta or self reflexive. So thank you for being so articulate about all this. And I really could have gone another hour, but yes, we have to know when it's time to end. And I like to end, I like to end by asking guests if you have some advice for our listeners or some specific exercise or tip, something you could do in the next week that might enhance your creativity.
You know, Keith, it's a really good question because I really spent some time with it. And, one of the things that I think is a really nice thing to do, and in fact, my stepfather and I had a very close relationship, and he was a therapist and he had very poor eyesight. And so he and I used to do these things together, like being outside. He had a house right on the Long Island shore. And we would sit out on his deck and I would be like, what color is that? And we were looking at the ocean and he's like, he's from Rhode Island. I wish I could do the accent, but he's like, it's blue. So I want to say, look and identify what a color is. I look at the sun hitting the buildings and I'm like the goldenness of New York City at the light on a brick building is something spectacular. So take a moment and look at what you're seeing and try to slow down and identify what color is that? Not just what you think the color is, but what color is the light on a red brick at 6 o'clock in the summer? Very different color than in the winter. So look and try to see what those colors are. You will be amazed what you see. And that will push you to react differently. And I think that would be a fun assignment to do.
Wonderful. Steve, thank you so much for the conversation today.
Thank you, Keith. This was great. And I hope I didn't talk too much. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Steve is a very successful professional artist in New York City. In our interview, he reflected on his own creative practice in a really articulate way. I think you have to be able to do that when you're teaching art school students how to create and how to see and how to reach their own creative potential. Remember that I started the interview by asking Steve how he teaches people to be creative. And in his answer, he didn't say that he teaches them how to have better ideas or more ideas. In fact, he said he teaches them not to think about the final work, not to think about where the process is going. Instead, he teaches them how to connect the hand and the brain to drive the process forward. He teaches them how to see in a new and different way. Creativity for Steve emerges from the process of making a mark. It's a process of dialogue. It's a process of working. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.